The following audio recording has been designed for learning purposes only. Do not share, distribute, or provide any type of copies, or this audio lesson will not be made available to you. Good luck with today's lesson.
So, strengthening the Sherman Antitrust Act, an important law in 1914 is the Clayton Antitrust Act. So, make a little star. That is one that people often neglect to study and forget about, and then get it wrong on the test. So, Carrie Nation. So, Carrie Nation was definitely a force to be reckoned with. She had been abandoned by her husband, and who had a drinking problem, and she decides that she is going to be a champion of temperance, and she works tirelessly to bring attention to the problem of drinking in this country. And she makes talks and speeches across the country, and she often takes her axe with her and goes into saloons along the way and smashes them up and gets arrested. What I often find quite incredible is that that she gets arrested but then released, and then she goes on to continue to do this, which is destruction of property. But she did get a lot of press for her crusade.
There was a funny thing that said that there was a sign outside saloons that says all nations except Carrie.
Oh, that's funny. That's
Yeah,
interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I read that on my Crime Against the Great Lakes book.
Oh, wow. Huh. So anyway, Carrie Nation does bring a lot of attention to the temperance movement. And of course, by the end of the Progressive Era, you will see the amendment to the Constitution banning alcohol.
Which would later, I believe it was the Volstein Act that banned it.
Well, the Volstein Act is actually the law that is the law that will then be written after the Constitution is changed to say that it's possible for the government to ban alcohol. It gives the government the power to do that. I haven't brought up these two African American leaders of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And actually, W.E. Du Bois well into the middle of the 20th century because he lived so long. So first, Booker T. Washington and Du Bois had competing visions of what they saw as African Americans' role in American society. And so Washington took a more conservative view in which he felt that African Americans should assume a place in society that was not as perhaps exalted, as high up as white people. This was certainly something that Du Bois did not agree with at all. And Washington would make a speech at the Atlantis Fair, World's Fair, which specifically talked about that. Booker T. Washington is also known for being a founder of the Tuskegee Institute, although our book talks about him being a founder, but I was doing more reading about him recently. And actually the Tuskegee Institute already existed, but he was asked to be its president and brought a great deal of attention to it and made it into a significant trade college for African Americans. So it was an industrial trade college that served the freedmen in the decades after the Civil War. What's that? Sure. Okay. And Washington believes that African Americans should, in these early decades of freedom, work with their hands, and that they should not expect to be elected to political office or expect that they should be able to go to college to earn higher degrees and become doctors and lawyers. And certainly that puts him at odds with W.E.B. Du Bois. The Atlanta Compromise speech, which Du Bois makes in 1896, will talk about these ideas and essentially talk about accepting racial segregation, which is known more commonly as Jim Crow. And the Supreme Court would articulate that only a year after Du Bois had made this speech. The Supreme Court in 1896 essentially said it was legal to discriminate against people due to the color of their skin. In Plessy versus Ferguson, it was a case that had worked its way through the court system in which an African-American gentleman sued after he was made to leave the first-class railroad car for which he had purchased a ticket. He said that because of the color of his skin, he was not allowed to sit there, but there was no other first-class car for him to sit in, and so therefore he paid for a first-class ticket and was forced to sit in second class. And yet the Supreme Court said that that was perfectly legal. It's considered to be one of the worst decisions of the Supreme Court, which of course would later be overturned in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka many decades later, of course, which we will eventually get there in the next unit. So the Atlanta Compromise speech of 1895, these are the major points in which Washington makes. He says that Washington Reconstruction had failed. It had offered African Americans what he saw was too much too soon. Essentially, the government telling African Americans that you can do whatever you want, and which, of course, white Southerners totally disagreed with that. And here, yet you see Washington essentially backing up, in some respects, what so many whites were forcing upon African Americans, a segregated society. They should accept their social status of segregation and give up their aspirations for political power and resistance to civil rights and higher education. So, like I said, he was talking about don't expect to be doctors and lawyers. You should work with your hands first. He was talking about gaining the respect of the white community, and then future generations, hopefully, would be able to go on to have higher aspirations. And, of course, he was the president of Tuskegee College, and he advocates for industrial training, so working with your hands. Of course, W.E.B. Du Bois did not buy into this at all. Du Bois was the first African American to graduate from Harvard University. So therefore, he was able to prove that you do not have to sit back and be complacent with what the white community is forcing on you. But he was able to go to Harvard. He is a writer and an advocate for civil rights, and he spends his entire life dedicated to improving the station of the black community in this country.
How did he get into Harvard?
Well, I suppose like anybody else does, he had good enough grades and they accepted him. I haven't read the whole story about exactly how that happened, if there was any special circumstances, but nevertheless, he does break that glass ceiling and is the first African American to graduate from Harvard. he would go on to help found the NAACP. He's one of the founding members in 1909. And he lives a decade into the civil rights movement because he doesn't die until 1963. Unfortunately, he dies just before the Civil Rights Act is passed. So that's really unfortunate that he didn't live long enough. Actually, he became quite discouraged towards the end of his life that the civil rights movement wasn't going far enough, going fast enough, and he became so discouraged that he actually leaves this country and moves to Africa, to Ghana in Africa. And that's where he dies. The last year of his life was spent in Africa. So that's a little bit about the life of W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the great leaders, early leaders of the African American civil rights movement. You've heard me talk about Lewis Hine, who was an advocate for ending child labor. And it was his photographs that I showed you a number of them in the last, was it the last chapter? Or two, a couple of chapters back maybe. But you saw a lot of his pictures. I probably showed a dozen of them a couple of weeks ago. And it was through the National Child Labor Committee, which hired him, that then allowed for him to be paid to go around the country, taking these images that were then published in many national publications, drawing attention to the plight of children in industry. And Congress would take note during the Progressive Era of this movement and would then pass the Keating-Owen Act in 1916. I think you heard me talk about this law before. Now, Congress doesn't say that it's illegal for children to work. In 1916, it didn't believe that it had the authority to do that. But because Congress has the authority to regulate interstate commerce, it says that any goods made by children could not be shipped across state lines. So it doesn't make it illegal for kids to, say young girls, it still is very common for them to clean house with their mother. Of so many young women and immigrant women, African American women, Irish women worked as maids in the 19th century. And so it was still okay if you took your kids to work and helped you do that. So things, if you're doing some type of job where you were not producing a good that would be sold outside your state, it was still legal. But this greatly reduced the number of children in the workplace. And then that, of course, leads to more and more children attending school. Because you never know, even if there's laws passed, it really, for children to go to school, really depends on how well it's being enforced by the local community that passed that law. But now with children not being able to work to a great extent, you find more and more children staying in school, and at least until the prescribed age of the state in which they had to be in school. And then, and historically, that's usually 8th grade. Although I have seen in some southern states that it's lower than that. It might be 6th grade. And then, of course, because the country still is very rural, it's not illegal for children to work on farms, on the family farm. And I'm not really sure how that could be regulated, because obviously food would be shipped over state lines, but
Also, I'm pretty sure the farms were probably massive.
well, most family farms are not massive. Plantations were, of course. And these are the constitutional conventions, constitutional amendments, which are passed late in the Progressive Era. And so towards the end of the Progressive Era. 1913, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, which creates an income tax. Therefore, the federal government now has a source of revenue, source of revenue that does not rely on the import taxes, the duties for goods being brought into this country from other nations or from the sale of land, which, of course, that income tax was necessary if the government needed more funds, if it's going to have regulation to try to create that a nation in which you're going to regulate big business and protect the general public from the excesses of big business. The 17th Amendment to try to deal with political corruption on a national level, taking away the power of the political bosses, the political machine in each state, which really was the force behind appointing the United States senators. Now the senators, at least in theory, are more responsible to the electorate and not to the political elite. The adoption of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution in 1919, which prohibits alcohol. And then in 1920, the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. All citizens will have the right to vote. And there was only one woman who had attended the Seneca Falls Convention back before the Civil War that was still alive. Seneca Falls Convention was the first convention held where women got together to demand that they have the right to vote, but it takes about 70 years for that actually to happen. So that's the end of chapter 18, and we'll move now into chapter 19. Oh, actually, what I was going to do in between 18 and 19 is actually, and I probably bring it. We're going to see two short films, one on William McKinley and one on Theodore Roosevelt. So the two presidents who are in office at this period, just at the turn of the 20th century. McKinley, who's elected in 1896 and then again in 1900, but of course assassinated soon after he starts his second term, and then Roosevelt, who will finish McKinley's second term and then win the presidency in his own right. But I have to run again, so talk amongst yourselves. Do that. McKinley had been a champion for the gold standard. And of course, he is President of the United States at the time of the Spanish-American War. And sometimes he is referred to as the first modern president. Certainly, you could make an argument for that in the case of the Spanish-American War, where we launched this war against a foreign nation, which was in the midst, really, of a civil war at the time. So McKinley believed at least that we needed to step in because of the atrocities that, well, they were definitely very concerned about the atrocities that were being perpetrated by the Spanish government against the Cuban people. But then the last straw was seen as when the battleship Maine had blown up. So, but often Teddy Roosevelt is seen as a champion of expanding presidential powers. And many books will refer to him as the first truly modern president because he's doing things that had not been done before. He's taking powers that other presidents had not assumed before. Although by standards today, he would be considered to be extremely weak president. But he's setting a precedent for expanding presidential powers more so than really most previous presidents, other than sometimes in extraordinary circumstances, like Lincoln, of course, during the Civil War.
Continued to expand the boundaries of the nation. But under every president through Grover Cleveland, America remained deliberately isolated from Europe. That all changed at the very end of the 19th century, under the leadership of William McKinley.
We are all here to do something, to work out a destiny. Drifting will not do. It is essential to have a purpose.
William McKinley was a widely respected lawyer from Canton, Ohio. A distinguished Civil War veteran, he threw himself into politics to fill a void in his life after his baby daughter succumbed to typhoid fever. His second child died in just 2 years. Serving 6 terms in Congress, he became best known for the McKinley Tariff Act of 1890, which helped protect American industry from foreign competition. He was patient and courteous, and always meticulously dressed. And it was said he was the only man in Congress with no enemies. He was also totally devoted to his wife Ida, who suffered from periodic seizures and severe depression.
Only those who have suffered in a similar way can appreciate the keenness of such affliction. Oh, if you could have seen what a beauty Ida was as a girl.
By 1891, he was elected governor of Ohio, and it then wasn't long before his name was put forward as the Republican candidate for president. McKinley lost what became known as his front porch campaign, and during the summer of 1896, 750,000 people made the pilgrimage to Canton, Ohio to hear him speak.
since I was old enough to think intelligently that I would sometime be made president.
His first act upon learning of his election was to seek out his mother and kneel for her blessing. The old lady, who had always wanted him to become a clergyman, prayed, "Oh God, keep him humble."
McKinley came to office as uninterested in foreign relations as any president we've had. He was enormously interested in domestic affairs, but he had to learn what he could about foreign relations once he was in the office. He was a man of short stature, 5'6", I believe, who'd gained a little more weight than was good for him, but he was immensely likable. I don't know any other president with whom he can be compared in this respect, except Dwight Eisenhower.
Despite his desire to keep his focus domestic, during his first year in the White House, McKinley was forced to confront a crisis in Cuba, which was fighting for its independence from the Spanish Empire. Determined not to become involved in a war, he ordered the American battleship, the Maine, to anchor off Havana and simply observe. But on February 15, 1898, the Maine mysteriously exploded, killing more than 250 on board. When the news reached the United States, it was assumed the Spanish had attacked the ship, and war fever broke out across the nation. But McKinley resisted.
The United States should never enter upon a war until every effort for peace has been exhausted.
Critics accused him of cowardice and indecision, and under the stress of the crisis, the president grew haggard. Sleepless, he paced the White House by night.
I have been through one war. I have seen the dead piled up, and I do not want to see another. If war comes, the thought of human suffering is almost overwhelming. I was one of those who held back to the last moment.
If McKinley had refused to ask for a declaration of war, most historians think Congress would have imposed a declaration of war upon him. McKinley dragged his feet against an aroused opinion as long as he could, and he only decided for war when he felt the time had come. Consensus was such that he had to move. Then move he did.
McKinley threw himself into the job of commander-in-chief, transforming a corner office in the White House into the first modern war room. His target was Manila Bay in the Philippines, where Admiral George Dewey rapidly destroyed Spain's Pacific Fleet.
The effect of this remarkable victory upon the spirit of our people and upon the fortunes of the war was instant. A prestige of invincibility attached to our arms.
It was followed by a massive attack against the Spanish Navy in Cuba.
In less than 3 hours, all the Spanish ships were destroyed. The hand of God was in the ordeal.
With McKinley seeing it as a unique opportunity to spread American ideals abroad, the U.S. became Cuba's protector and took possession of Puerto Rico and Guam. For the first time, America was becoming a world power with colonies.
It is no longer a question of expansion with us. It is manifest destiny. Our flag is the flag of freedom, of hope, of civilization.
But when McKinley tried also to take control of the Philippines, America was accused of becoming the new oppressor. Angry Filipinos called for death to the tyrants, war to the false Americans who have deceived us. and on February 4th, 1899, fighting broke out.
So I'll actually talk more about the war with Spain, but the Filipinos say that the Americans have deceived us because they were in the midst of their own civil war, just like the Cubans trying to push the Spanish out. And when we come in during the Spanish-American War, they fight with us, but then we refuse to grant them their freedom, and we take the Philippines as a colony. And so they will continue that war then against us, which we brutally put down. It's actually a precursor to what happened in Vietnam, and so this talks a little bit about it.
Nothing is left for us to do but to put down the rebellion. This territory is ours, and we mean to carry our civilization there.
It became America's first overseas guerrilla war, and atrocities abounded. Captured Filipinos were forced to dig their own graves. Then they were lined up and shot. Whole villages were set on fire, and entire towns were leveled. One American general wrote, "It may be necessary to kill half the Filipinos in order that the remaining half be advanced to a higher plane of life."
It was brutal, nasty. Oh, we were not again engaged in major hostilities of such a character until Vietnam. But, of course, nothing makes it easier to forget outrages than success. And I dare say that if the Vietnam War had ended in the way that the Philippine War ended, Americans would now have accustomed themselves to and forgotten the brutalities, which is exactly what happened with the Philippines.
I have had enough of it. I have had all the honor there is in this place, and I've had responsibilities enough to kill any man.
With military success abroad and a return of prosperity at home, McKinley was easily re-elected, running with Theodore Roosevelt, the hero of the war in Cuba.
I am no longer called the president of a party. I am now the president of the whole people.
In the summer of 1901, William McKinley left on a victorious 6-week tour across the American continent. Mingling freely with the crowds, he was the last chief executive to do so without Secret Service protection.
If it is in the mind and heart of anybody to kill me, he will do so, for plenty of opportunity will be offered him.
On September 6, 1901, McKinley attended an exposition in Buffalo, New York.
And this World's Fair was very much like the one that I talked about in Chicago. It was huge, it was elaborate. There were canals on which you could take boat rides, large neoclassical buildings just like in Chicago as well.
There, without warning, an assassin took aim and fired. The gunman was a Czech-born anarchist who had fired his gun twice, hitting the president in the chest and stomach. At first, it looked as if the president would survive. The nation's hope rose with each passing day. But a gangrenous infection set in, and within a week, McKinley's condition was determined to be fatal. His last words were spoken 8 days after the shooting.
Goodbye, goodbye to all. It is God's will, His will, not ours, be done.
He was the third American president to be assassinated. Nearly 40 years after Abraham Lincoln's death, and 2 decades after James Garfield was shot and killed. His coffin would rest in the East Room of the White House during a period of intense national mourning. It rained hard on the day of McKinley's funeral. As America's first modern president, he had presided over an era of international expansion. And the new president, Theodore Roosevelt, spoke for the nation when he called him the most widely loved man in all the United States.
All a man can hope for during his lifetime is to set an example, and when he's dead, to be an inspiration for history.
McKinley's successor reveled in America's new power. Theodore Roosevelt once said his only regret was that he didn't have a war to fight. Ironically, by the time America entered World War I just 8 years later, the country's commander-in-chief was an academic. One of the most peaceful...
And we'll definitely be hearing certainly more about Woodrow Wilson coming up next week. So next is, this is just next part on Teddy Roosevelt. This is that series on the American president that I use from time to time. In this, coming up in the next few weeks, there will be a series that I use from time to time. We won't be able to see the whole thing, but it's on the American century, on the 20th century.
Even a strong chief executive like Grover Cleveland saw his primary job as wielding a quiet hand behind the scenes, ensuring the smooth operation of the Republic. But just 4 years after Cleveland, a new breed of president burst onto the scene. Theodore Roosevelt saw himself as a 20th century gladiator, infatuated with his own strength and power.
No individual ever led a really worthy life unless he possessed power. I believe in power. The timid man, the lazy man, has lost the great fighting virtues. Some people thought at the time that Theodore Roosevelt was crazy. He became a health nut and an outdoors nut. He challenged the whole country to be as enthusiastic about conservation as he was, to be as enthusiastic about the West, to be enthusiastic about showing the flag, and I'm sure that that's the public side of all the effort he put in while developing himself. He forced himself to become what he naturally wasn't.
The secret of Teddy Roosevelt's obsession with power lay in his sickly beginnings and his struggle to live up to the expectations of his demanding father. Raised in the Civil War era into one of the most socially prominent families in New York, he was severely nearsighted and so racked with asthma he could barely breathe.
I was a sickly boy, nervous and timid. I had to train myself painfully and laboriously.
His father once told him, Theodore, you have the mind, but you do not have the body. You must make your body. So over the years, Teddy Roosevelt compulsively lifted weights.
Oh, how little worthy I am of such a thought. I feel such a hopeless sense of inferiority to him.
In 1878, while Roosevelt was attending Harvard, his father died of stomach cancer. As Teddy grieved, friends witnessed an aggressiveness that went out of control. One day, irritated by a neighbor's dog, he pulled out his pistol and shot the animal dead. Only when he married a young woman named Alice Lee was Teddy able once again to take pleasure in his life.
She is so marvelously sweet and pure and lovable and pretty that I seem to love her more and more every time I see her. Though I love her so much now that I really cannot love her more.
But on February 12, 1884, the day after Alice gave birth to a baby girl, Teddy's life shattered again. First, his mother died of sudden typhoid fever. Then, within hours, 22-year-old Alice also died of childbirth complications and undetected Bright's disease.
When my heart's dearest died, the light went out from my life forever.
In his grief, Roosevelt's aggressiveness went out of control again. He tore every picture of Alice out of his scrapbooks and burned all her letters, and he never again mentioned his wife's name. Leaving his infant daughter in the care of his sister, he headed west for the Badlands of Dakota to become a cattle rancher.
I owe more than I can ever express to the West. I herded my own cattle, killed my own food, shot bears, captured horse thieves. No one can understand the keen delight of lonely lands.
Roosevelt let solitude and open spaces and intense physical labor heal his broken heart. But more importantly, he taught himself how to channel his aggression into a unique form of energy with a purpose.
The only thing to do is treat the past as past. To dwell on it, above all to keep talking of it with anyone, would be both weak and morbid.
In 1885, on a trip back east, he renewed an acquaintance with childhood playmate Edith Caro. The following year, they were quietly married and moved into Sagamore Hill, a Long Island man.
And so actually, everybody thought that they were going to be married because they had been so close well into being their late teens. And then he shocked his family when he ended up marrying the woman who was his first wife. So it actually was not that big of a shock to anybody when he married Edith, his second wife.
That had been designed for Roosevelt's first wife. Here they raised 6 children. Sagamore Hill was Roosevelt's private retreat from the world and became a symbol of the man himself. Edith had little influence on the way it was decorated, and it came to look more like a hunting lodge than a home.
And that buffalo, we just discovered that it came from this private hunting preserve in New Hampshire, because that's where it's the area where I'm doing research, because I'm going to write something on saving the American buffalo. And Roosevelt actually visited that preserve where the guy I'm researching lived, and where they had this herd of buffalo. So it's kind of neat that's only recently been discovered in the last few years. It came from this same reserve in New Hampshire.
Here, above his desk, Theodore Roosevelt hung a painting of his revered father. Still trying to live up to him, Roosevelt insisted that his own children stay active and physically fit.
I would rather one of them should die than have them grow up weak.
Over the next decade, Roosevelt climbed his way up a spiraling series of political appointments. He was Civil Service Commissioner under 2 presidents, then Police Commissioner of New York City, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President McKinley.
I rose like a rocket. I intended to be one of the governing class.
And when war with Spain erupted in 1898, he shipped off for Cuba as a lieutenant colonel in the Army. He fought alongside his own special regiment, known as the Rough Riders. And all his deep-seated aggressiveness had an outlet.
I killed a Spaniard with my own hand, like a jackrabbit.
His soldiers returned victorious, and Roosevelt became an instant war hero. It was then a meteoric rise to power. He easily won the governorship of New York. Then in 1900, the Republican Party chose him to run as the vice presidential candidate alongside McKinley. The new century began with their decisive victory.
A big part of the reason why the Republican Party wanted him to be a vice president was because as governor of New York, he was bringing about a lot of changes that the establishment Republican Party did not agree with. And so they thought this would be a good way to get him out of New York. And plus, it would be the kiss of death politically, because being vice president of the United States is really not that great of a job. Especially then, they generally didn't have you do anything. And so, and then historically, vice presidents really very rarely ever become president. So they thought this would be the end of his political career. He would serve as vice president and then fade off into obscurity and not bother them anymore. And he proved them wrong.
But just 6 months into his term of office, Roosevelt received word of McKinley's assassination. At 42, he was the youngest man ever to become president.
It is a dreadful thing to come into the presidency this way. I feel as if father's hand were on my shoulder.
Teddy Roosevelt refused to recognize that he had now far surpassed the achievements of his father. So he kept pushing himself, and in doing so, he began transforming the office into what would become the modern presidency. Unlike Cleveland, he embraced the press, establishing the first official White House press room.
Theodore Roosevelt was the first president to exploit the first electronic medium, the wire services. He made absolutely the most he could of that resource. Teddy set out to be a great national source of entertainment, education and entertainment. He made his family a soap opera for the time and extended the presidency in so doing. He had a very active bunch of young boys, and he happily allowed to be publicized their adventures in the White House. The time they rode their pony up to the living quarters on the second floor was a national event.
When he wanted the public's support, he did what few presidents had ever done. He went out and asked for it. And with that support, Roosevelt began redefining executive power, claiming presidential authorities not specified in the Constitution. Going far beyond Andrew Jackson or Grover Cleveland, he insisted that a president could do anything he wanted for the good of the people, except what the law specifically prohibited.
Under this interpretation of executive power, I did and caused to be done many things not previously done by the President. I did not care a rap for the mere form and show of power. I cared immensely for the use that could be made of the substance.
As one of the country's earliest conservationists, he had a passion to preserve the American wilderness. To do so, he invoked a wartime power, the executive order, to forcibly acquire vast parcels of land from private hands. Then cajoling Congress into creating the Forest Service, doubled the number of the country's national parks and reserves.
I don't think any president ever enjoyed himself more than I did.
He also used the presidential power of persuasion, settling a volatile coal strike by becoming part of a mediation. He backed labor unions when he found them more willing to compromise in a crisis than the company owners. And in an age when a few rich men controlled much of the nation's wealth through monopolies, Roosevelt worked hard to make the trusts behave, becoming a hero with middle-class America.
Roosevelt managed to find ways of acting that would dramatize his words outside the realm of legislation. The president had a very limited role in legislation and overstepped it at his peril. He was very respectful of powers that be. So much so that Harry Truman, years later, when I worked for him, who'd been a young man in Teddy Roosevelt's time, used to refer to Theodore Roosevelt as that four-flusher. He talked a good game, but what legislation did he ever get through Congress? Teddy knew better than to get into a dogfight with the leadership of Congress, so he found acts to take that were outside the congressional realm. He masterminded and organized a coup against the country of Colombia, creating the state of Panama so that it would conclude a treaty for the Panama Canal.
Because we were unwilling to pay the amount of money that Panama wanted for us to have the rights to build the canal. Because the French corporation had gone bankrupt, so we had to buy them out, and then Panama wanted too much money, so Roosevelt thought, well, we'll just divide Colombia. And so we were the first nation, and we were instrumental in organizing that coup, and that we sent our Navy to block the port so that Colombia couldn't send any troops in, and then we're the first nation in the world to actually recognize Panama as a new nation.
Maneuvering in Central America was classic Roosevelt.
Sorry, Nathan, what's that?
What is a coup?
What's a coup?
Yeah.
When you overthrow a government. It's called a coup d'etat, an overthrow of the state.
First, he sent in his Navy to prop up a revolution, then did an end run around both Congress and Bogota to get what he wanted, the Panama Canal.
I do not think the Bogota lot of jackrabbits would be allowed to ball one of the future highways of civilization. So, I took the canal zone. I met Congress debate, and while the debate went on, the canal did also.
In November 1906, Roosevelt journeyed to Panama to tour the construction. The first sitting president ever to travel outside the United States, he himself had become the symbol of United States dominance abroad. Regretting that he presided over an era of peace, Roosevelt tried to leave a military mark by doubling the size of the U.S. Navy. In 1907, he made a display of power no country believed possible. He sent the American fleet around the world. He considered it his last great accomplishment during his 7.5 years in the White House.
Okay.
Theodore Roosevelt was just 50 years old when he completed his presidency and returned to Sagamore Hill. To the end, he continued to channel his aggressions into productive energy, driven all his life by the ever-present influence of his father. Every event of my life is tied up with him, he once said. I almost feel as if he were present with me.
While president, I have been president. I have used every ounce of power there was in the office. If only my father could have lived and seen me in the White House.
In the decades after Theodore Roosevelt, presidential power continued to expand.
And we will continue with that theme eventually. But now we have to move on. So there's Theodore Roosevelt, often considered to be the first modern president. And the cousin of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Quite distant cousins. So, we've heard a little bit about imperialism already when we saw the film on McKinley, colonizing foreign nations by using both business, political, and the military to colonize peoples, to exploit their resources. Also to create new markets as well. That's an important aspect. To exploit their resources, often in the process of colonization, in order to try to create a similar society to the country that is colonizing them, in order to want them to then buy the goods from whatever country is colonizing them. So for America, try to make them more American-like, make them live more like we lived, and then sell them the products that our corporations were selling them. Taking their raw materials, making them into whatever we're producing, and then having a more expanded market around the world. So this process actually begins before McKinley and the Spanish-American War. We see it under Andrew Johnson. In 1867, we purchased Alaska for $7 million, or about 2 cents an acre. It's considered to be one of the great land deals ever. It was a great bargain. It was negotiated by the Secretary of State, William Seward. Many people thought that it was ridiculous and a waste of American money because it was so remote. But others see it as being the first advancement towards taking Canada. There's a great deal of thought in the 19th century that Canada is going to be next as part of acquisitions and joining the Union. This is actually a thought that appears quite often over the course of the 19th as well as into the 20th century. 1867 is also the year that the United States acquires the Midway Islands. Midway Island is a coaling station for American ships because it's midway between North America and Asia. So American ships that are crossing the Pacific Ocean, trading in foreign lands, selling American goods. Because steamships, just like airplanes, only had limited capacity for their fuel, and so you would have to stop at some point and get more fuel. And coal was what everything ran on at that time.
in 1898, Hawaii is annexed under McKinley. Cleveland had not been in favor of the annexation of Hawaii, or it could have happened sooner. It actually happens, though, under McKinley when we were at war with Spain. It was seen as necessary to ensure that we take Hawaii during this time of war. So Hawaii, the government of Hawaii actually had been overthrown by a group of American businessmen who were unhappy with the Hawaiian government and monarchy and wanted Hawaii to become an American territory. Congress had not been so sure for several years, but now they made up their mind when we're at war with Spain. And we're, of course, at war with Spain in the Pacific, in the Philippines, as well as in the Caribbean. In this cartoon, you can see Uncle Sam loaded down with all kinds of American goods, American-produced goods, such as steel that he's carrying in his hand, steel rails, actually, as well as furniture and sewing machines and anything, clothing, anything that American businesses make. You can see a child's tricycle up here. And this idea that American business should be allowed to sell their manufactured goods anywhere around the world. And that we did not want to be left out of trade. And we are very concerned with European nations that were at the time in the 1890s dividing up China and closing off access to China. And we say that all the ports of China should be open to trade with the United States and other nations around the world, but specifically for the United States to be able to sell our goods. And of course, where's the stepping stone to China? Here Uncle Sam has his foot, one foot in the United States, now one foot in America, and the idea is, of course, we want to have a foothold in China. The idea of dollar diplomacy is really part of this imperialistic idea that you don't always have to use the military. You can use business and you can use the banks to exert their power financially in foreign nations. So it's not always necessary to send the military to colonize, but if you get enough money into a country, business interests that can influence politicians there, you can essentially have a form of colony without sending any troops. So it's an economic policy that was often used in Latin America, so in Central and South America, by providing loans, and therefore you could ensure the loyalty of nations in other countries towards the United States government. When Roosevelt became president of the United States, he asserts America's right, what was always perceived as America's right, to be the dominant power in North America. And essentially he reiterates the Monroe Doctrine. He says that European nations need to stay out of the Americas, and that if there's problems in the Americas, it's the U.S. government that has the right to intervene to help our neighbors, and in times of perhaps a unstable economic situation or perhaps a military situation that doesn't go well in Latin America, and that we will intervene, we will help our neighbors, and that we don't want European governments interfering. We don't want European nations to reassert themselves in the Americas, reestablishing colonies in the Americas. Because for the most part, European governments, especially Spain, had been thrown out of many of the Latin American nations in the early part of the 19th century, and we don't want to see them coming back in. When the Monroe Doctrine had been put out by President Monroe in the early 19th century, the United States military, of course, was extremely weak. And while it was a nice idea politically for America to say that we are the dominant power and we will come to our neighbors' aids, and European nations, we don't want you colonizing again here in the Americas. America in the 18 teens does not really have the ability to follow up that statement with military power to take on these powerful European nations. But we have much more of an ability to do that in the early 20th century. Still, we're still ranked quite low according to the various military powers in this period, though.
Over the next 10 years, though, doesn't that increase like dramatically?
It will definitely increase, especially with the military buildup that led us into World War I. Yeah, that's a good point. I want to turn to the American media, the press, in this period of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There's actually two major publishers that control a vast majority of the American media, which would have been the printed media at this time, because there is no radio and clearly there's obviously no television yet. And Joseph Pulitzer, so you've probably heard of the Pulitzer Prize for literature awarded to journalists. Well, he established a fund that gives that cash prize. But he was a major publisher out of New York City. The New York World was his paper, and he sensationalizes the press. So the idea of news stations that like now, where you have so many talking heads that aren't really telling you the news, that they're giving you their opinion about the news, which is what goes on so many cable channels, of course, today. It really starts with the printed media over 100 years ago, and it's because of this guy here, Pulitzer, in order to sell more of his newspapers. I think that's come up in the past, where I said because of the advancements in printing, publishers were able to put out morning editions, afternoon editions, evening editions, and then if needed, special editions. Say if there was a major crisis like a bombing or a war starting, they could put out special editions to update the public throughout the day. William Randolph Hearst is the other major publisher in this country. He actually copies what Pulitzer was doing, and he builds a vast media empire in the 20th century that will eventually include not only newspapers but magazines as well, and eventually even radio stations, radio media. So William Randolph Hearst is really quite famous for the fact that he eventually moves from New York to California, where he had grown up and spent much of his childhood, and doesn't divorce his wife, but lives openly with his mistress, Marion Davies, a starlet in Hollywood, at a time when that was quite scandalous, and yet he didn't care. And it's often seen that it's due to the New York Journal and Hearst's reporting that led the United States into the Spanish-American War. Hearst's papers were doing a lot of reporting, sensationalizing what was going on in Cuba, as well as telling a lot of of truth too. There were a lot of atrocities going on in Cuba at the time that they were bringing to the public's knowledge. And so this sensationalism of the media is called the yellow press at this period in history. And it comes from a cartoon strip that was in the New York World called Hogan's Alley. It gets dubbed the yellow press. The main character is this little kid who always wears this yellow outfit. I'm not quite sure what he's wearing. Little babies in those days wore dresses, whether you're a boy or a girl. So I suppose that's what he's wearing. Some kind of cloak or dress.
What is that?
It was a cartoon called Hogan's Alley. All these antics of this kid. And for some reason it gets named, the yellow press is associated with this cartoon. So the atrocities in Cuba were making national headlines in the 1890s. The Spanish nation had colonized Cuba, of course, about 400 years earlier. Cuba was one of the early stops on Columbus's voyages. And the Cuban people actually, if you go back to the 1870s, there had been a revolution that was brutally put down. But in the early 90s, the revolution starts back up again. And the yellow press here in the United States has reporters in Cuba reporting on what exactly is going on there. The Spanish government had established a number of concentration camps in which they rounded up the rural population and forced them to live in towns. Towns that were not adequate for the number of people that were actually living in them. So there's about 300,000 people that are put under military control in these concentration camps. But they didn't have enough food or proper sanitation, and about 30% of the people end up dying. So that it's a horrible situation in which the Cuban people find themselves. The reason why the Spanish government did this is that they felt that it would be a way that they could control the revolutionaries and hurt them, because much of the aid for the revolution in the countryside was coming from the rural population. So they thought this would take away their source of funding and food, but it then creates this horrible humanitarian crisis in Cuba, which the people of the world are made aware of because of the reporting that was going on and being published in American newspapers, as well as certainly European newspapers. And this was all being done under the Spanish military, a Spanish general that I'll talk about in a moment. General Weyler was actually in charge in Cuba, and so as I said, there's this propaganda war that's being waged in the United States, often due to not just the American press, but there's a lot of Cuban people who have immigrated to the United States and that are pushing politically for the United States to do something. But that, it's really quite obviously very unusual for the American government, especially at this time, to become involved in a foreign government's affairs. Because, of course, remember, America is historically isolationist, and we thought that rightly so. European governments were always warring against each other, really wrecking their economy, killing off large numbers of their people, and that we didn't want to become involved in that type of situation. And so the government here is very, very hesitant to do anything about it. McKinley does try to do diplomatically intervene, try to bring about some type of solution, but he's really unwilling to send the military. Of course, the United States is, does have many people that are very interested in Cuba, though, because going back already to at least the mid-19th century, it was thought that eventually one day Cuba would become an American territory, possibly another state. And so there's many people that are really just waiting for the opportunity to be able to send the military in to grab Cuba as another territory. McKinley's really doesn't think that's such a good idea.
What was the reason for wanting Cuba so bad?
Well, it was so close to the continental United States.
Just because of the location? That's really the only
Apparently, it's right off the shores of Florida. Just a lot of people thought, it's just so close. Why not? And of course, it was a wealthy island that you could grow a lot of sugar cane, so a great deal of wealth economically could come from Cuba. So obviously, that would have had a big deal of the thought process. And so here's McKinley in this cartoon measuring up on Uncle Sam, and it's hard to see what's written in the stripes of his pants, which are, of course, just like the American flag. But of course, America had acquired Texas, and then we've acquired Florida. We've acquired Louisiana, the Louisiana Purchase, then California, and then I'm not sure what's saying there. Oh, but then it's saying I think that says Havana, and then it says Puerto Rico. So this idea is that we're going to expand into Cuba and these other islands. Or is it Hawaii? Oh, Hawaii. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Hawaii. And so, but actually Hawaii and Puerto Rico, of course, are only taken at the time that we go to war. So we will go to war. And the reason why we go to war is because, of course, the battleship Maine is blown up in Havana's harbor. But we don't go to war immediately when the battleship Maine is blown up, because there's enough political will in Congress by those who don't want to take Cuba as another American territory, that as a requirement of declaring war against Cuba, we add to the war declaration what's called the Teller Amendment, that the United States will not take Cuba as a colony when we, the idea was, of course, that we will win, which we did, but we will not take Cuba. And that's the Teller Amendment. It's really quite extraordinary, considering that there had been for decades, so much thought that this would probably happen. So let me just switch screens here. These are some slides that I have on the Spanish-American War. So there's William Randolph Hearst, whose yellow press is writing constantly. Richard Harding Davis is his chief correspondent in Cuba, who's relaying these news articles back to the Hearst newspapers that are publishing on the atrocities in Cuba. This is General Weyler. General Weyler is made the face of everything bad that's happening in Cuba. He is there overseeing the military, and essentially there's a military rule in Cuba at this time. He's made the chief villain of the Spanish government because it was hard to villainize the queen mother and the king, because the king was this teenage kid who had, his mother was ruling as the regent, and she was an Austrian princess by birth. So it was hard to villainize this this mother and her child, and so they villainized this General Weiler, who clearly was, he even has this Germanic name, which was, so he's not even really, he must be Spanish. I don't know his whole background, but clearly has to, this German name. Battleship Maine is actually sent to Cuba. There's so much uproar in the United States with the press constantly talking about everything bad that's going on in Cuba. There's a lot of business interests in Cuba, a lot of businessmen doing business in Havana. So President McKinley decides in the winter of 1898 to send the battleship Maine to Havana's harbor as a show of force and a show to the American businessmen that we are there to protect you if anything goes wrong. This is actually seen by the Spanish government as being a great affront to their authority, that here we sent our battleship right into the harbor at Havana, overlooking the city. And so it's seen as a threat. The battleship will be blown up in February of 1898. But to this day, we actually don't know exactly who did it, because it could be a variety of players. It could have been the Spanish military themselves. It could have been there's a number of citizens that have an organization in Cuba, Spanish citizens, that are very pro-Weiler. And it could have been that organization. And it could have been the Cuban rebels themselves who are fighting against the Spanish. But nobody actually ever came out to say, we did it, to claim that we did it. So we actually don't know. And the investigations that took place afterwards were never able to prove anything definitively either. So, yeah.
I think maybe it was the U.S. and what was
So this is the theory, and I'll explain a little bit more about the three players that it's possibility. So it could have been the Spanish government, Spanish military, but Spain is not the power that it had been back 200 or 300 years ago before this. It is no longer a major European power. It's really quite weak, and the nation of Spain actually is quite poor by this time. So to enter into a war with one of the leading industrial nations, that it was really not seen as a great idea. Actually, the United States government is able to raise $50 million that after this happens, in the event that we do go to war, just in a very short time, which completely amazed the royal family in Spain. The Queen couldn't believe that we could raise $50 million at the drop of a hat to fight this war, which is something the Spanish could not do. So that's where the government itself stood. So could it have been the supporters of General Weiler in Cuba? Again, it's the same situation. Would they be willing to risk a war with the United States with its growing military power and all of its money behind it to fight a long war? And, so that, again, is really quite questionable. And then finally, there's the Cuban rebels, who's a ragtag bunch of revolutionaries who are desperate to win this war against Spain and throw the Spanish government out after 400 years of colonization. So in the end, who would it benefit more to actually force the United States into a war? And so that's the thought. And, in theory, you would think it would be, of course, the rebels. But do we know for sure? No. So we can only speculate. But, McKinley is not willing to send the military in to put down the Spanish government simply because they are committing these horrible atrocities against its people. But once an atrocity has been committed against the United States by killing our soldiers, then, and even then, McKinley was hesitant. He does not declare war for 2 months. He does not ask Congress for a declaration of war until April. So there was actually an investigation that took place then after the battleship sank. And finally, McKinley decided that there's such a huge outcry by the public and by the press that he asked for a declaration of war. So, and actually, the battleship would actually sit there for about 20 years in Havana's harbor until finally the government insists that the United States remove it. Well, that was a whole interesting process when it's finally taken up, because they have to create a way to do that. So they actually build this casing all the way around it and pump the water out, and then they're able to dismantle it. Oh, and what's interesting about the way that it sank as well was there were theories that it blew itself up, because this form of battleship had a design flaw. The boilers tended to overheat, and also where the ammunition was kept was apparently too close to the boilers. But the investigation shows that it's an outside object that blew it up, because the metal on the ship, the hole that was blasted in the side of the ship, blew inward and not outward. And so that would show that it actually hits a mine. And so a mine that could have easily been dropped by any small fishing boat that went by not too far from it. And see, in the evening, just before the ship sank, it had turned. They turned it, and it turned right into where the mine was. So, this is Admiral Dewey. He was in charge of the Pacific Fleet at the time, and he wired Washington to know what should his instructions be in the event that we go to war with Spain. Was this solely going to be a war in Cuba, or should Dewey lead the fleet to the Philippines and engage with the Spanish in the Philippines as well? The Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time was Theodore Roosevelt. He happened to be in the office at the time and not the Secretary of the Navy. Roosevelt replies and says, "Take the Philippines." Now, which they do, actually. So McKinley could have reversed this order, but he didn't. And so actually the first engagement in the Spanish-American War comes in the Philippines, in which Admiral Dewey will lead the Pacific Squadron into the harbor at Manila in the early morning hours, actually the middle of the night, so it's dark. They pass by Corregidor, which is the island, fortified island that does not fire on the Navy. And the Spanish Navy comes out of this harbor here, and they engage. They fire at each other over the course of a few hours. They actually take a break for breakfast. They move out of the way, so this map is showing when Dewey orders the Navy to stop. The men had been working all night getting ready, and then they engage later in the morning, and within a few hours the entire battle is over with. The Spanish Navy was defeated, and now it's only to negotiate the surrender. It's only left to them to negotiate the surrender, in which some of the Spanish will insist that our military come off the ship and we make an attempt to take the fort. It was all done as a show, not for any real reason other than that the Spanish military apparently was embarrassed by how poorly they did, and they wanted to say that they were overwhelmed by the show of force by the American ground troops. And so as our troops rushed to the fort, the Spanish will throw up the white flag and surrender. And that's what happened. We had been negotiating with the Filipino rebels as well. And the rebels thought that we were going to back them for their freedom once we got there, but we didn't. And so then we saw, of course, in the film what happened. They turned their guns on us, and we brutally suppressed the rebellion. Here back home in the United States, the military is not prepared to launch an offensive in which we have to invade an island nation. So that had really never happened before. Well, there is the exception, of course, in North Africa in the War of Tripoli in the early 19th century under Jefferson, where we do invade and defeat the Pasha's troops. But nothing of this scale had ever occurred really before. And so it's necessary to call up volunteers, and men rush to sign up. Roosevelt will resign his commission as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy and form the Rough Riders, a cavalry unit made up of New York City aristocrats like he was. They call them Knickerbocker aristocrats. The Knickerbocker Club's private gentleman's club. Not like on 8 Mile, but you know, and then made up of cowboys, because Roosevelt, of course, had cowboys, all those friends who were cowboys, and had worked out on his ranch out west. So cowboys, and then actually American Indians joined as well, because of course Roosevelt would have been friendly and familiar with many of the Indian tribes out west. So it's really an interesting cavalry unit that he forms. And they begin training initially in Texas, and then will finish their training down in Florida. So this is in San Antonio early on in the spring of 1898 when they began their training. And then, like I said, they'll move on to Florida. There were also African-American troops that will fight in the Spanish-American War as well. And so this is showing some of that training. I'm not quite sure what this is supposed to actually do for you, to just have a blanket where they throw you up in the air, but I don't know. The soldiers, these are pictures that were taken at the time. Some soldiers from a variety of regiments that will form. This was a regiment from New Jersey, getting their mail. Here's a target practice. The washroom. Actually, large numbers of soldiers get sick, actually, and die. It's just like what happened early on in the Civil War, where so many soldiers who came from rural areas, not exposed to a lot of the outside world and germs and disease, get into close contact with people from all over the country. And once some type of bug hits, it spreads very quickly. The men are all living in close proximity to each other. And so many men will end up dying before they can even be sent to Cuba. Here you see a man being taken to the hospital. Here's issuing the beef. The beef was actually injected, much of the beef was injected with formaldehyde because they weren't able to properly keep it cool. And so they think it's a good idea to inject it with formaldehyde. Horrible idea. It was actually poisoning the men, and it causes a huge scandal. There's actually an investigation in Congress that goes on after the war is over with. Men refuse to eat it. The cooks start chopping it up and trying to make stews or somehow hide the flavor. But it was really a terrible situation that occurred there with the food situation. Often there was not more than a day's supply of food once the men get to Cuba. So it was really a precarious situation with the food the entire time that the war went on. Fortunately, it was actually a short war. So here's the men in the mess line. They're cooking out on the beach in Florida. Here's the men are doing their laundry. That was the enlisted men. The officers actually stayed in the Tampa Bay Hotel, which was the headquarters of the 5th Corps headquarters. And so the officers in charge would eat in the dining room. They would go out on the veranda and smoke their cigars in the evening and talk about actually the Civil War, because these are all older guys, many of them veterans of the Civil War, both veterans of the Union Army as well as the Confederate Army. There were some men who come back and fight in the Union Army now, but who had fought for the Confederacy, and which was actually quite interesting situation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I find that.
So I would have liked to have heard some of those discussions, but it's believed that the war is going to be short. But it's also believed they also make the decision that the main invasion will not be till the fall. That the initial invasion, which will be only bring a few men, small numbers of soldiers into Cuba during the summer because of the heat in the tropics and because of the fear of the tropical diseases that they don't want to go through the ranks and decimate the troops. Theodore Roosevelt is determined that he is going to be one of the first soldiers, him and his men, the Rough Riders, to make it to Cuba. And he's not going to let anything stop them. Actually, this is the Oregon, the battleship Oregon, shelling Santiago, Cuba. There was initial efforts before the invasion to try to block the harbor at Santiago, which actually failed. They sent in a ship. This is actually one of our monitor ships that was used in that war. It was ironclad. It had been developed during the Civil War. It's very slow moving. The U.S. collier Merrimack was sent into Santiago's harbor with a skeleton crew of men in order to sink it, but unfortunately it sank the wrong way and it didn't blockade the harbor. The men were then sat out the rest of the war as prisoners of the Spanish military, but nevertheless heroes for their actions. But that was unfortunate because the Spanish Navy was in Santiago's harbor, and that there would have to be a later battle in order to deal with that then. This is the Rough Riders on their way to board the ships to take them to Cuba. And it was an interesting situation because the government didn't have the proper railroad cars, so they actually or ships for that matter, so they commandeered private vessels. And many of the railroad cars that take the men down from Tampa to the docks, which was something like 10 or 15 miles away, it was done in the middle of the night, and many of the railroad cars had just held cattle in them, and so they're full of manure. And the poor guys are there all night long in these cattle cars that are disgusting. But when they get there, it's complete chaos. Nobody had ever organized an invasion like this before. The men weren't prepared either because they didn't have the proper uniforms. The government had been stockpiling lots of wool uniforms in the event of Indian uprisings out on the Great Plains, which can get awfully cold in the winter. And they didn't have a lot of light uniforms, light fabric. And so the men are wearing these heavy wool uniforms and being sent to Cuba. And so it's not a good situation. It's already quite hot in the late spring of 1898 when the invasion begins. The men actually lived on the ships for a week before they actually left. So Roosevelt was insistent that they would leave first, so he actually gets his men on board a ship without giving orders to get on that ship. It happened to be a former coal transport that had been hastily converted and put bunks into where this coal storage was. So there's all this coal dust down in there where the men are. And so it was really an unhealthy situation. that the men found themselves, because essentially what they did was live for 2 weeks on these ships. Well, the first week while they're waiting for the orders to go out, because initially they were sent out, they were brought back because they were afraid there was a Spanish gunboat or a torpedo boat that was going to sink them. And then it took so long to get reorganized again because they had taken off all the horses. They had put them back on. And it's about a week. And then it takes about a week to get there because there was orders that they couldn't go faster than the slowest ship. And some of these ships are really old because the Navy didn't have enough ships. And so they were private. This is actually what the general staff looks, General Garcia, who heads the Cuban rebels. This is General Garcia here in the center here with the white beard and his staff. And they're really extremely poor. They're really hard fighters, though, and they know what's going on. They know the lay of the land. And they're often ignored by our military when we get there. But they actually put up a diversion fight so that it allows our troops to land. And this is a photograph of some of the first troops that landed in Cuba and putting up the American flag. It's pretty fascinating, too, about how the invasion takes place because our ships travel along the Cuban coast for a week with the lights on. Actually, there was a ragtime band that played on the officer's ship at night. It was all lit up. And we passed by various Cuban Spanish forts that could have fired on us at any time, and they never did. And so this was not a secret operation. Everybody knew that we were coming. We finally arrive at Siboney and at Daiquiri. There's two areas where the troops disembark. This is at Siboney. They actually showed in the film some of the actual film that was taken by Edison cameramen of the men landing. And here's another picture landing at Siboney. The dye was coming off the wool uniforms. It was really too hot. And many of the men stripped down to their underwear or nothing at all. And Richard Harding Davis from the Hearst newspapers writes that there was never such an invasion that happened in history to the laughs of the fellow men. And then the first battle takes place at a place called El Caney. Roosevelt actually gets some wooden chunks of wood that splinter off a tree and hit him, but he's okay. The Spanish were unable, though, to match the American firepower. And I know we're running late, but the Spanish didn't have smokeless. Let's see. We didn't have. Let's see. The Spanish didn't have smokeless powder, and so we were actually able to see where they were. Our troops had a lot of the old-fashioned powder. It creates a great deal of smoke, which was interesting, but it kind of provided cover, I suppose, in some of the fighting that was going on. We had a weapon that the Spanish had never seen before. It was called the Gatling gun, and it's a precursor to the machine gun, which terrified the Spanish troops, and they all fled. So we were able to win the battles against the Spanish quite quickly. I'll have to finish this when I see you guys next week.
Good luck with today's lesson.